Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church Sunday School Lesson number 5, Sunday, July 2nd, 2017. The lesson is entitled Moses and the Burning Bush. The lesson comes from Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. We were asked to read Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 22. The place is Horeb. The time is 1445 BC. When God called a prophet, it always seemed to be for a specific purpose. His call to us today may be less dramatic and pointed, and yet we may be just as sure that God has led us just as definitely. As you prepare to teach this lesson, keep in mind that your students will eventually be thinking about God's call to them, whether they have had a call or will ever have one, what it means, and when it will happen. By the end of this quarter on the call of God, you should aim to answer their often unspoken questions on this theme. You should teach them that a specific call from God for their lives is possible. They should learn to be open to a call and not to construct a false call from their own imaginations. Today's aim: facts. To examine the facts of the call of God to Moses. Principle: to show that God's directions always overcome our objections. Application: to emphasize that if we are willing to follow God's call, we can be sure He will provide all we need to fulfill it. Illustrating the lesson: our excuses are no deterrent to God's purposes for our lives. Practical points. 1. No matter where we are or what we are doing, God knows how to find us and get our attention. Exodus 3, 1 through 3. 2. To answer the call of God, we must remove anything that interferes with the holiness of God. Verses 4 through 5. 3. We must always recognize and reverence the awesome power of God. Verse 6. 4. God has a plan to deliver His people. Verses 7 through 10. 5. Kings and rulers are no match for God. Verse 11. 6. God is always with His servants. Verse 12. Golden text. The cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppressed them. Come now, therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Exodus 3, 9 through 10. Today we have 4 lesson outlines. 1. The circumstances of Moses. Exodus 3, 1. 2. The divine appearance. Exodus 3, 2 to 6. 3. The divine message. Exodus 3, 7 through 10. 4. The objection of unworthiness. Exodus 3, 11 through 12. Introduction. The Old Testament prophets are worthy of great admiration. We marvel first at the way God used them to part waters, call down fire, multiply food, strike people with leprosy and blindness, heal the sick, and even raise the dead. Such deeds struck awe into their contemporaries and helped turn them to God. But we also must admire the prophets for what they were willing to endure. Prophecy was a high calling, and it demanded absolute obedience to God. Surely, we surmise it took a special breed to fill this office. A study of their lives and callings, however, reveals that they were ordinary persons who simply yielded to God's call. This will become evident in our next 5 lessons, which deal with the calling of 5 prophets. The first prophet is Moses, whom the Jews considered the greatest prophet of all, yet God called him from the humblest of circumstances. The circumstances of Moses. Exodus 3, 1. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert, and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb, his occupation. Exodus 3, 1a. The account of Moses' appearance begins on an unimpressive note. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. The Hebrew construction implies that this was his normal occupation. Indeed, it was, and it had been for 40 years. But this statement leaves unmentioned his earlier life of privilege in the Egyptian court. Brought up by Pharaoh's daughter, chapter 2, verses 5 through 10, he had access to all the learning and power of Egypt, Acts 7:22. However, Moses had chosen to identify with his own oppressed people and had even killed an Egyptian slave driver, Exodus 2:11 through 12, Hebrews 11:24 through 26. To avoid the consequences of this rash act, he fled Egypt and found refuge among the Midianites, who at that time inhabited the southern and eastern part of the Sinai Peninsula, Exodus 2:15. There he married Zipporah, a daughter of Jethro or Ruel, the priest of Midian, verse 16 through 22. Thus his life had taken a drastic shift and his privileged past was forgotten. His location, Exodus 3:1b. In the course of his duties, Moses led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. Backside refers to the western side of the desert, since to Semitic peoples east was always considered the forward direction. Horeb was the alternate name for Sinai. Exodus 3:12, 19:10-11, 1 Kings 19:8, Acts 7:30 and 38. Here in Exodus 3:1, it is called the Mountain of God, in anticipation of its later role in the giving of God's law to Moses. The location of this mountain is uncertain. The traditional site tourists see today is Jebel Musa, Mountain of Moses, located in the south of the Sinai Peninsula. The Israelites gave little thought to its location, and the only recorded visit there was that of Elijah, 1 Kings 19:18. The divine appearance, verse 2. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Verse 3. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. Verse 4. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. Verse 5. And he said, Draw not nigh, neither put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Verse 6. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Moses' attention arrested. Exodus 3:2-3. And Moses tended the flock. The angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. As in many Old Testament occurrences, this angel was none other than the Lord himself. Verse 4. The bush most likely was a thorny shrub common in desert regions. The suggestion of some that its leaves or berries gave the appearance of fire surely mocks the intelligence of Moses and the power of God. What draws Moses' attention was that the bush was in flames, but was not being burnt up or consumed. What this may have signified is left for us to surmise. One suggestion is that it stood for the fiery affliction to which the Hebrews were being subjected, but which could not destroy them. 1 Peter 1:7, 4:12. Another is that it represented a holy God's fiery judgment on the oppressors of his people. Isaiah 66:15, 2 Thessalonians 1:7-9. Or again, it may simply have symbolized God's presence. Hebrews 12:29. In any case, the burning bush fascinated Moses. He said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight. Exodus 3:3. A thorn bush in the desert was no great sight, not even one that was burning. What made it unique was that the fact that it was not burned up, and Moses was determined to find out why. Moses' worship commanded. Exodus 3:4-5. From the midst of the bush came the voice of God calling, Moses, Moses. The use of both Lord Yahweh and God Elohim in this verse leaves no doubt that the speaker was the angel of the Lord. In verse 2, the Lord's appearance in this case was not as a human being, but as a voice from an unextinguishable fire. Moses was left with no doubt that he was standing before deity. From within a fire that did not consume, he heard a voice that did not come from a visible person, and the voice knew his name. The repetition of Moses' name indicated the urgency of the message he was about to give. 1 Samuel 3:10. Moses answered typically, Here am I. Exodus 3:4. Proof of God's presence is always evident from the command that came from the voice. It said, Draw not nigh hither. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou stand is holy ground. Exodus 3:5. First the Lord warned Moses not to come any closer. This inhibited his natural desire to gaze at this unique phenomenon. Verse 3. Later, at the same spot, God would warn all Israel to stay away from his consuming presence. 19:12-13, 21-24. Second, he commanded Moses to remove his sandals. This was the symbol of a servant's humility before his master, and may also have signified the shredding of all human pretense or merit. Joshua was later given the same command when he stood before the Lord, Joshua 5:15. God gave Moses the following reason for this command. The place whereon thou standest is holy ground, Exodus 3:5. This is the first occurrence of holy in the Bible. It signifies what has been set apart from common use and dedicated to God. It is important to note that there was nothing inherently holy about this spot in the desert and nothing magical about the bush. They had special significance only because God's presence was there. The place was never intended to be revered or as a shrine. We must be careful to avoid revering holy places. Today, holiness on earth resides only where God dwells, in the church body and in the individual believers. 1 Corinthians 3:16, 6:19. God's identity revealed. Exodus 3:6. The one who demanded Moses' reverence now revealed himself as the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. The singular father may refer primarily to Abraham, the patriarch, to whom God first made covenant promises, Genesis 12:1-3, 15:7-12. However, it also referred collectively to the other patriarchs, Isaac and Jacob, who received the same promises, 26:2-5, 28:13-15. Through earlier training by his parents, Moses knew of this covenant, God and his promises to Israel. Now the Lord was speaking to him personally and letting him know that he had not forgotten his people. They had endured 4 centuries of affliction in a foreign land, as he had foretold, Genesis 15:13. Nevertheless, that was drawing to a close, for he would deliver them, verse 14. Moses would play a key role in this, so it was essential that he knew the one who was calling him. Having received this revelation, Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Exodus 3:6. He recoiled from God's glory, just as later saints would do. Judges 6:22, 13:22, 1 Kings 19:13, Revelations 1:17. Knowing that viewing it could prove fatal, Exodus 33:20. In the final analysis, of course, it is impossible for anyone to see God's essence except as revealed in Jesus Christ, John 1:18, 1 Timothy 6:16. The divine message. Verse 7. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. Verse 8. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good land, and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Verse 9. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. Verse 10. Come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Deliverance for Israel. Exodus 3:7-8. The Lord had appeared in order to give Moses a message of deliverance. He said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people, which are in Egypt, and heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters. He was well aware of their sorrows. Many people reveals that the extended family of Jacob had now become a nation. Indeed, their sense of identity had been foretold by their common sufferings. The human-like descriptions of God, seeing, hearing, knowing, and coming down, do not imply that God has bodily limitations. They simply mean that he is aware of human events and, in fact, takes an active role in directing them. In this case, he would intervene in supernatural ways to deliver Israel. Believers of all generations can take courage from the assurance that God is concerned about their sufferings and knows how and when to deliver them. The Lord promised not only to rescue Israel from the power of the Egyptians, but also to lead them out of that land and into a good and spacious land, one that flowed with milk and honey. The land to which God would take his people was a herdsman ideal, providing pasture on which his animals could thrive and produce milk. It also was a place where bees could produce honey in trees and rocky crevices. In short, it was a land of plenty. In addition, it was a large land, spacious enough to support the various peoples already living there. The nations enumerated here do not compose a complete list. Canaanites were the descendants of Canaan, the son of Ham, Genesis 10:6. Hittites were probably migrants from the Hittite Empire of Asia Minor. The Amorites were westerners, that is, people from the west of Mesopotamia. Perizzites were villagers, those living in unwalled towns. Little is known of the Hivites, though some scholars have identified them with the Horites, another people who dwelled in Canaan and had considerable influence. The Jebusites were inhabitants of Jebus of Jerusalem. Assignment for Moses, Exodus 3:9-10. The Lord repeated his awareness of Israel's suffering. The term cry indicates an outcry that comes out of distress or wickedness, calling for God's intervention. Abel's blood called to God, calling for Cain's punishment, Genesis 4:10. Sodom's cry called for judgment, 19:13. In Exodus 3:9, Israel's cry of distress called for deliverance from Egypt and retribution on their tormentors. God assured Moses that he had heard their cry and seen their oppression. Moses must have rejoiced that at long last his people would be delivered. But the now therefore of Exodus 3:9 is followed by another now therefore, verse 10. And the words that followed must have shocked Moses. God said, Come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people out of Egypt. God was calling him to do what God himself had promised to do. The commission was so clearly given that it could not have been misunderstood. The objection of unworthiness, verse 11. And Moses said unto God, Who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? Verse 12. And he said, Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. Moses' reluctance. Exodus 3:11. Had God commissioned Moses to this task 40 years earlier, he probably would have accepted it eagerly. At that time, he had brashly stepped in as a patriotic deliverer of his people. Chapter 2, verses 11 through 12. He had failed, however, because he had acted in cocky self-confidence, trusting his prestige as a member of Pharaoh's court. Impetuous and self-willed, he was unfit to undertake a work of God. Now, however, after being schooled in humiliation and adversity, he had the opposite problem. He saw himself only as a lowly shepherd, unqualified both to contend with Pharaoh and to lead a nation. Who am I? Exodus 3:11 sums up his utter lack of self-confidence. Judges 6:15. Yet this had to be the starting point for one whom God would use. He must utterly depend on God. The Lord's assurance. Exodus 3:12. God gave Moses a twofold answer to his doubts. First, he said, "Certainly I will be with thee." His own presence and power would more than compensate for Moses' weaknesses. He would teach him the truth that his strength is perfected through human weakness. 2 Corinthians 12:9 through 10. The Lord did not speak to raise Moses' image of himself, for he was inadequate. Instead, he appealed to Moses' faith in his power. Second, the Lord gave Moses a token or sign of his call and presence. He promised, "When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain." Exodus 3:12. This mountain means Horeb or Sinai. It would be there that Israel would receive instruction on how to serve him. This was not the kind of sign that would immediately strengthen faith. It was a promise that required faith, but it pledged that when Israel was free, Moses would bring them back to this very spot. Questions. 1. Moses was born in Egypt. Why was he tending sheep in the Sinai desert? 2. At what mountain did God call Moses? Where was it located? 3. What drew Moses' attention to the bush in the desert? 4. What did the Lord's repetition of Moses' name signify? 5. What did God command Moses to do as he approached the bush? Why? 6. Are there such things as holy places? Explain. 7. With whom did the Lord identify himself to let Moses know he was Israel's God? 8. What did the Lord promise to do for Israel? What role would Moses have in this? 9. How did Moses respond to God's call? What caused this response? 10. What answer did the Lord give to dispel Moses' doubt? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, July 2nd, 2017. Thank you for listening. God bless.